The Vitrified Forts of Scotland. You are standing on a wind-swept Scottish hillside, and something is wrong with the walls in front of you. Not wrong in a subtle way, wrong in a way that makes your hand stop mid-reach because the stone beneath your fingers is not rough the way stone should be. It is smooth. It is glassy. It flows in frozen waves the way cooling lava flows, and you are looking at granite, one of the hardest, most heat-resistant materials on the surface of this planet, and it has been melted, not chipped, not carved, not shaped by human hands with tools, melted, fused at the molecular level into a single, unified, glassy mass. And across the Scottish Highlands, over 70 of these hilltop fortifications exist, built roughly 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. And every single one of them carries this same thermal signature: temperatures between 1,000 and 1,200 degrees Celsius pressed permanently into the stone. And to understand why that number is so disturbing, you need to understand that flowing volcanic lava sits at around 800 to 1,000 degrees, meaning whatever heat source was applied to these walls was hotter than lava, sustained, directed, and concentrated against stone structures on remote Scottish hilltops by people who, according to every conventional archaeological account, were working with nothing more sophisticated than timber and flint. And modern scientists took that conventional account seriously enough to actually test it. They built experimental reconstructions. They stacked timber against stone walls and burned it under the most ideal conditions possible. And what they found was that wood fire alone cannot do this, not even close. That achieving this level of vitrification would require tens of thousands of logs burning simultaneously in perfect, sustained conditions, with heat directed into the stone rather than simply around it. And the vitrification at these sites did not weaken the walls. In several documented cases, it strengthened them, bonding the stone into a near indestructible mass that has survived 3,000 years of Scottish wind and rain and time. Which means either these Iron Age peoples were deliberately engineering a construction technique so thermally advanced that modern material scientists cannot fully replicate it, or something arrived at these hilltops and pressed its heat signature permanently into the stone. And nobody, not geologists, not archaeologists, not material scientists, has produced a complete, satisfactory explanation for how it happened. Now, Mohenjo-Daro. And before you picture a ruin, you need to picture a living city. Because in 1900 BC, Mohenjo-Daro was not a primitive settlement. It was a sophisticated urban civilization of perhaps 40,000 people, with grid-patterned streets and a centralized drainage system so advanced it would not be matched in Europe for another 3,000 years. Multi-story buildings, public baths, a culture thriving at the exact same historical moment the Egyptians were building the pyramids. And then, in a moment that the archaeological record cannot fully explain, it ended. And when excavators began brushing away the dust in the 1920s, what they found stopped the entire archaeological community, because the skeletons were not buried. They were not arranged. They were simply fallen, scattered in the streets mid-stride, mid-motion, as if every living person in the city had been struck down simultaneously, without warning, without time to flee or fight, or even fully understand what was happening to them. And at the epicenter of the site, excavators found thousands of black lumps, fused, crystallized, bubbled fragments scattered across what had once been streets and buildings. And when scientists analyzed these fragments, they found that the material had been vitrified, melted, and re-hardened, transformed by temperatures estimated between 1,400 and 1,500 degrees Celsius, hotter than lava, hotter than any known ancient weapon, hotter than any accidental fire, hotter than any volcanic event in the region's geological record. And the vitrified zone radiated outward from a central point in a pattern that material scientists recognize immediately, and that British archaeologist David Davenport, after 12 years of studying the site, described in his assessment as consistent with an aerial detonation, a blast from above. And then there is the matter of the ancient Hindu texts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which contain passages describing weapons of almost incomprehensible destructive power, weapons that delivered blinding light and columns of smoke and fire that burned so hot it turned the earth to liquid. And Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, when asked after the Trinity detonation whether this was the first nuclear explosion in history, did not say. Yes, he quoted the Mahabharata, and the texts he referenced describe a weapon unleashed upon a great civilization of the Indus Valley. And Mohenjo-Daro stands today in silence, its vitrified streets and fallen dead, asking a question that modern science has never been fully comfortable answering. Now Tal el-Hammam. And this is the site that changes the conversation, because here the science is not theoretical, it is published, peer-reviewed, documented in the journal Scientific Reports in 2021 by a team of researchers whose conclusions were as careful as they were extraordinary. And Tal el-Hammam was a thriving Middle Bronze Age city on the northeastern shore of the Dead Sea, large, prosperous, heavily populated, sitting in one of the most fertile agricultural corridors of the ancient world. And around 1650 BC, at the absolute peak of its power, it was destroyed. And the destruction layer reads like a forensic record of something almost incomprehensible. Mud brick walls had not burned, had not collapsed, had vaporized, leaving only their stone foundations behind. Pottery shards across the site had been exposed to temperatures so extreme their surfaces had melted into glass. Zircon crystals within the excavated material showed evidence of having been instantaneously subjected to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of volcanic lava, hotter than any known natural ground-level fire. And the 2021 research team's conclusion was that the evidence was consistent with a cosmic airburst event, a meteor or comet fragment detonating in the atmosphere above the city, releasing a thermal pulse and shockwave of near-nuclear proportions. And the shockwave evidence was written into the very angle of destruction. Walls did not fall inward from fire, they were blown outward and down, compressed into the earth by a pressure event arriving from above. And then there is the salt. The book of Genesis describes Lot's wife turning to a pillar of salt, and the soil composition around Tal el-Hammam shows an extraordinary salination event coinciding precisely with the destruction layer. A cosmic airburst over a salt-rich Dead Sea environment could have aerosolized and distributed salt across the entire region in a single catastrophic moment. And whether Tal el-Hammam was truly Sodom may still be formally debated. But if the scientists are right, then the ancient writers were not recording a moral parable. They were recording the day the sky burned and an entire civilization vanished in a single flash of light. Now, Sacsayhuaman. And you need to stand in front of this place in your imagination before any explanation is attempted. Because Sacsayhuaman sits high above the ancient Inca capital of Cusco at nearly 3,800 meters above sea level, and its walls are constructed from limestone and andesite blocks of scale so incomprehensible that modern engineers who visit the site reach reflexively for their calculators and then quietly put them down. The largest individual stones weigh an estimated 200 tons. Some researchers place specific blocks closer to 300 tons. They were quarried from sites 15 to 35 kilometers away, across mountain terrain, across river valleys, across a landscape that makes the logistics of their transportation a question that no conventional engineering explanation has fully resolved. And the blocks fit together with a precision so absolute that a sheet of paper cannot be passed between them. No mortar, no adhesive, just stone meeting stone in perfect interlocking geometry. Angles cut so exactly that the wall functions as a single unified structure rather than an assembly of individual pieces. And none of that is the deepest mystery. The deepest mystery is what happened to the stone itself. Because specific sections of Sacsayhuaman, most notably concentrated in what archaeologists have identified as the oldest strata of the entire site, show unmistakable evidence of vitrification. The surface of the andesite in localized but significant areas has been fused, melted, transformed from the structured crystalline composition of natural volcanic stone into a glassy, flowing surface, carrying the thermal signature of temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. And andesite is not a delicate material. It is volcanic in its own origin, born from extreme heat. To remelt it, to push it back past its own thermal threshold, requires sustained temperatures that no known ancient technology should have been capable of generating. And the pattern of vitrification follows the exterior-facing surfaces of the oldest walls, as if the heat came from outside, directed at the structure, concentrated against it with intention. Not an accident, not a hearth fire that spread, but something that arrived at these walls and pressed its signature permanently into the stone. And the Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the 16th century were so staggered by what they saw that they recorded in their own chronicles a genuine belief that the fortress had been built by demons. Not as a figure of speech, they literally struggled to construct a human explanation for what they were looking at. And the Inca themselves, when asked, pointed not to engineering, but to a race of divine builders who preceded even their own civilization's memory. And Sacsayhuaman stands today, impossibly built, inexplicably melted, its massive stones locking together in silence above Cusco like a puzzle assembled by hands that history cannot quite name, now Rajasthan. And this is the site that nobody speaks about loudly. Because in the 1990s, during routine geological surveys near Jodhpur, researchers detected something that triggered immediate concern. Radiation levels in the area were abnormally elevated, high enough to raise official flags, high enough that further investigation was quietly but urgently initiated. And what they found beneath the surface was a layer of ancient ash, thick, sprawling, covering an estimated 3 square miles. And not ordinary ash, ash that when analyzed carried the same chemical and structural signatures as the residue produced by a nuclear detonation. The vitrified remnants within the layer showing evidence of exposure to temperatures and pressures that no conventional ancient world explanation can account for. And nearby, partially excavated ruins suggested the presence of an ancient settlement at the time of the destruction event. A community of people living and functioning, and then catastrophically gone. And this is where the Mahabharata becomes something other than mythology, because the text describes the Brahmastra, a weapon summoned through sacred incantation capable of destroying entire cities, delivering a flash brighter than 10,000 suns, a blast zone requiring survivors to wait days before entry, and those who survived found their hair falling out, their food contaminated, their skin marked by something invisible and relentless. And read those words without their mythological framing, read them as testimony. Hair loss, contaminated food, invisible sickness spreading through survivors, a defined blast zone with a mandatory waiting period before entry. Those are not the symptoms of a sword or a catapult or any weapon the ancient world is supposed to have possessed. They are, with uncomfortable precision, consistent with radiation exposure following a high-energy detonation event. And the Rajasthan site has never been fully excavated. Access has been limited. Official statements have been measured and carefully worded. And beneath that desert ash, 3 square miles of scorched earth sit quietly, older than recorded history, hotter than anything ancient hands should have been able to produce. And what connects all 5 of these sites across continents and centuries is not speculation or mythology, or the selective reading of ambiguous evidence. It is stone, physical material analyzed by instruments under professional scientific obligation. And the stone, in every single case, tells the same story. That something arrived at these places and applied heat so extreme, so concentrated, and so sudden, that the very molecular structure of the earth was permanently changed. And the conventional explanations, warfare, accident, natural disaster, have been tested against the thermal evidence and found in every case to fall short. And the most honest statement any researcher at any of these sites has ever made is not a dramatic claim about ancient weapons or lost civilizations, but simply this: we cannot fully explain what we are looking at. And in that gap between the evidence and the explanation, pressed into the glass of melted stone on 5 continents, sits a question about the ancient world that the ancient world itself may have been trying to answer when it wrote about weapons that burned like 10,000 suns and cities that vanished in a single flash of fire from the sky.